Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker of this wonderful conference, Shierry Nicholsen. She's a psychoanalyst in private practice in Seattle. She studied briefly with Adorno in Frankfurt in the 1960s and has translated several of his books, including Notes to Literature, Hegel, Three Studies, and Prisons, the latter with Samuel Weber. In addition to her book, Exact Imagination, late work on Adorno's aesthetics. Her essays have appeared in numerous volumes on Adorno and the Frankfurt School. So it's really a good privilege and wonderful to have you here, Shierry. She's going to talk about Adorno's Minima Moralia, Malignant, Normality, and the Dilemmas of Resistance. So help me to welcome her.
So thank you, Samir, for inviting me, and Alessandro, and there you are, and Huyen for co-organizing and help, and thank you all for staying so late. And let's see, can you hear me all right? Okay, so I'm going to read. Adorno's Minima Moralia, Malignant Normality, and the Dilemmas of Resistance. This is the epigraph from Adorno. The logic of history is as destructive as the people it brings to prominence. Wherever its momentum carries it, it reproduces equivalents of past calamity. Normality is death. Malignant normality is a term coined by Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist who has researched situations of extreme destructiveness in their historical and social contexts. It refers, Lifton says, to an inhumane social actuality that is presented as normal, all-encompassing, and unalterable. Lifton coined the term in his study of Nazi doctors, with specific reference to Auschwitz. But it is, of course, not as though the fall of the Third Reich has meant the end of situations of malignant normality. Equivalents of past calamity, as Adorno puts it, can be produced in different contexts. Adorno's Minima Moralia is a key document for critical theory today, precisely because it addresses and describes the workings of malignant normality, both within a specific historical context and in the dynamics that recreate and are continuing to recreate it in different versions. Written during and immediately after the Second World War, its context is the malignant normality of the Nazi regime within the larger historical trajectory of advanced capitalism, as Adorno experienced it in his exile in Southern California. Intrinsic to Minima Moralia at the same time is a reflection on the slight possibilities of resistance within the totalizing nature of this malignant normality. The diagnosis of malignant normality and the possibility of resistance cannot be separated. In this way, too, Minima Moralia is a key document for critical theory in the present. The attempt to formulate this conjunction of a malignant normality and the possibility of resistance is by no means unique to Minima Moralia, and later I will refer to some historical and social psychological studies of resistance within extreme destructive situations. If Minima Moralia does not immediately strike us as belonging with such studies, this is because it takes articulations of and reflections on individual experience, and the individual experience of only one person, Adorno himself, as its data and its method of research, so to speak. Minima Moralia is not, however, a personal memoir of suffering, resistance, and survival, but rather a set of short texts on a wide diversity of historical, cultural, and personal topics. As its subtitle, Reflections on Damaged Life, indicates, in Minima Moralia, experience is intrinsically linked to critical thought. Adorno would argue that using reflection on individual experience as the basis for the analyses in Minima Moralia is not an arbitrary choice. It follows from the specific phase of the broader historical trajectory in which he is living. Against Hegel's notion of an overarching objective Weltgeist, Adorno claims in his dedication to Minima Moralia, social analysis can learn incomparably more from individual experience than Hegel conceded. In the period of its decay, the individual's experience of himself and what he encounters contributes once more to knowledge. I didn't correct the gendered translation. If the illusion of the individual's absolute autonomy has disintegrated, there are enough remnants of the individual left outside the leveling of contemporary society for its malignancy to be read in the individual's experience. If we ask what is malignant about the malignant normality Adorno addresses, in one sense, the answer is simple. It is inhumane and brutal. It promotes suffering. And if we ask what is normal about it, the answer is also simple, but less so. It is normal because the brutality is couched, at least in superficial ways, in accepted social norms. It is also normal in that the conjunction of brutality and social norms is experienced as being without exceptions or loopholes, just the way things are. In this sense, the malignant normality claims to be total and all-encompassing. Despite Adorno's frequent, if glancing, references to the economic basis of malignant normality, Minima Moralia is in no way an analysis of the reach of global capitalism. Rather, its impact depends on its very precise articulation of the experience of this encompassing malignancy. All-encompassing means precisely that. One is surrounded, literally, by the malignancy. Wherever we look, there is an aspect of malignancy, and there seem to be no exceptions. The diversity of the facets of experience addressed in Minima Moralia reflects this all-encompassing quality. The malignancy of contemporary reality includes not only the world of social relations and the concrete details of everyday life, but the material world of human-made products as well. Witness, for example, Adorno's discourse on the failure of contemporary doors to indicate privacy. And when Adorno, the emigre intellectual, complains in a text entitled Refuge for the Homeless that dwelling is now impossible, he is not so much waxing nostalgic for what once was, as noting, among other things, the uniform absence of humane welcome and comfort in the built environment. The all-encompassing malignancy works inward as well as outward, penetrating as well as encompassing, and destroying the distinction between internal and external experience. In this regard, the effect of malignant normality on sleep and dreams is telling. Adorno cites a German magazine proposing that modern man wants to sleep on the ground. In effect, Adorno states, abolishing with the bed the threshold between waking and dreaming. The sleepless are on call at any hour, he continues, unresistingly ready for anything, alert and unconscious at once. Adorno and others have documented the terror that underlies this form of normality. In Germany, from 1933 to 1939, Charlotte Barat, a psychoanalytically informed journalist, collected protocols of dreams, which the dreamers identified as depicting their experiences in the Third Reich. These dreams, she says, bear witness not to internal conflicts in the dreamer, but to the penetrating force of terror in life within a malignant totality. Here, for instance, is the dream of a 45-year-old doctor, dreamed in 1934. Around 9 in the evening, after my office hours, as I am about to stretch out peacefully on the sofa in my apartment with a book about Matthias Grunewald, my room and my whole apartment suddenly become wall-less. I look around horrified, and all the dwellings around, as far as the eye can see, no longer have walls. I hear a loudspeaker blaring out, according to the decree of the 17th of the month regarding the elimination of walls. The next morning, the doctor wrote the dream down, and then he dreamed of being accused of writing down dreams. The distinction between reality and nightmare is eliminated along with walls. Individual nightmare and collective malignancy are thus two sides of the same thing. In a Minima Moralia text dating from 1935, Adorno describes the way his childhood memories of being mocked and bullied prophesied fascism. Now that the tormentors have stepped visibly out of my dream, he says, and dispossessed me of my past life and my language, I no longer need to dream of them. In fascism, the nightmare of childhood has come true. Society has, as it were, assumed the sickness of all individuals, he writes in another text in Minima Moralia. And in it, in the pent-up lunacy of fascist acts and their innumerable precursors and mediators, the subjective fate buried deep in the individual is integrated with its visible outward component. The surface of social relations and ordinary sociability becomes the normality of those whose individuality has been eliminated, sucked up into collective madness. Hence, Adorno can write, "Nothing is innocuous anymore. All collaboration, all the human worth of social mixing and participation merely masks tacit acceptance of inhumanity. Under capitalism, social relations are indistinguishable from commercial relations. Everything becomes a matter of connection or relationship in contemporary corporatist jargon." Adorno lays out the brutality of this deformation in a text called Health Unto Death. Neurosis and sexual repression, structures which rely on the distinction between inner and outer, waking and dreaming, conscious and unconscious in the individual, seem to have disappeared, he writes. But those who seem healthy, we might also say normal, are already dead. These are the ones who are ready for anything. The ingratiating qualities of these apparently healthy, connection-seeking people make them both temptingly attractive and confusing. Lifton devotes a chapter of his book, The Nazi Doctors, to Dr. Ernst B., a paradigmatic instance of what Adorno is talking about here. Lifton interviewed Ernst B. for many hours and was confused and suspicious when he initially found something likable in him. Indeed, Ernst B., who worked in a section of Auschwitz not directly engaged in killing, was thought by some prisoners to be an exception, a good Nazi. After the war, when Ernst B. was brought to trial for his wartime activities, he was acquitted, in part because of testimony by some of the Jewish prisoners that he had been nice to them. For Lifton, Ernst B.'s defining characteristic was his ingratiating sociability. He wanted to be liked, and he knew how to go about it. He was unusual in being on good terms with both his fellow SS doctors and the prisoner doctors he was in charge of. He got the prisoners to like him by calling them by name, and he got his fellow SS officers to like him by participating in their socializing. Indeed, he had joined the SS thinking of it as a good social club. And by the end of his interviews with Lifton, when he had apparently given up trying to ingratiate ingratiate himself with Lifton, Ernst B. was waxing nostalgic about the good times of idealism and solidarity with his SS colleagues. If nothing is innocuous, everything represents a temptation to acquiesce in inhumanity. In an all-encompassing malignant normality, the pressure to conform is relentless. The iconic dream with which Barat begins her book, The Third Reich of Dreams, speaks to the process of being worn down until one's resistance is broken and one gives in. This is the dream of a factory owner in his 60s, a lifelong social democrat. He dreamt it 3 days after Hitler took power. Goebbels comes into my factory. He has the employees line up in 2 rows, right and left. I have to stand between them and lift my arm in the Hitler greeting, Heil Hitler. It takes me half an hour to lift my arm, 1 millimeter at a time. Goebbels watches my exertions as though he were at a play, without applause and without any expression of displeasure. But when I have finally raised my arm, he says 5 words, "I don't want your greeting," turns around and goes to the door. So I stand in my own factory among my own employees, pilloried with my arm raised. I am physically able to do so only by keeping my eyes on Goebbels' clubfoot while he is limping away. I stand this way until I wake up. This man kept dreaming this dream over and over until finally in his dream his back broke. With the exhaustion of the effort to resist comes also the temptation to self-mutilation, to stupefaction or self-confusion, the destruction of our own mental capacities as a defense against the pressures of the malignant situation. The dream of a German cleaning woman from the summer of 1933 illustrates this. I dreamt that as a matter of caution, I speak Russian in my dream, a language I don't know at all, and besides, I don't talk in my sleep. I speak Russian in my dream so that I won't understand myself, and so no one can understand me, in case I say something about the state, because that is, of course, forbidden and would have to be reported. The malignant normality's pressures to conform, along with the corruption and stupefaction that are the consequence of conforming, extends to all situations in life. The professions, with their humanitarian ideals, are not exempt from such perversion. Lifton, himself a psychiatrist, emphasizes the vulnerabilities of professionals of all kinds. They can be tempted by money, by fame, by closeness to those in power, by the opportunity for scholarly contributions, among others. Lifton's book, The Nazi Doctors, is a study of the perversion of the medical profession, which was grounded on the Hippocratic oath to preserve life, but in the Third Reich comes to define its duty as killing. Lifton details the Nazis' recruiting of professionals to head agencies engaged in a variety of forms of medicalized killing. Nothing does more to sustain malignant normality than its support from a large organization of professionals, he notes, in his foreword to the 2017 book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. Much in Minima Moralia speaks to the particular difficulties that the all-encompassing malignant situation poses for the professional work of someone in Adorno's position as an émigré intellectual. Every intellectual in emigration is, without exception, mutilated and does well to acknowledge it to himself, Adorno writes. He evokes the sense of being hampered by isolation, unfamiliarity, or financial need, of constantly working against the grain, of becoming exhausted, and in one's exhaustion being tempted to abandon one's standards for one's work. The effort of producing something in some measure worthwhile is now so great as to be beyond almost everybody, he writes. The pressure of conformity weighing on all producers further diminishes their demands on themselves. the center of intellectual self-discipline as such is in the process of decomposition. For Adorno, as intellectual and philosopher, language, the very medium of his work, presents temptations to acquiesce in the inhumanity of malignant normality. The intellectual has no choice but to use language, and language, like the tools of other professions, can be co-opted in the service of maintaining the semblance of normality in a malignant situation. In his book, States of Denial, Awareness of Atrocities and Suffering, for instance, Stanley Cohen details some of the ways language can be perverted into accounts that serve to justify or excuse and thereby deny atrocities. It can be used to deny responsibility for the actions, to deny that injury was done, to deny that victims are victims and not perpetrators, to condemn those who condemn the atrocities, and to appeal to alleged higher ends that would justify the actions. The émigré intellectuals hope that writing in particular will be exempt from the pressures of a malignant normality, that it will serve as a refuge. The hope that for the man who has no homeland, writing becomes a place to live. That is an illusion, itself a form of denial. On the contrary, the difficulties that beset the émigré intellectual can serve as a pretext for indulging in writing that would otherwise be rejected as trash, or can lead to a wariness that stifles the free flow of energy necessary for serious writing. In either case, language becomes infected with social control and serves the denial through stupefaction that we saw in the dream quoted above, in which the dreamer tried to protect herself by dreaming in a language she did not understand. I'm sure you're thinking of all sorts of contemporary parallels and connections with the other talks, and I won't say them, but you can say them later. To recapitulate, malignant normality puts forth the claim to be all-encompassing, normal, and unalterable. I have stressed its all-encompassing nature, extending from the human-made environment to the unconscious itself. The claim to constitute the norm can be seen in the sociability of those subjected to the health unto death that Adorno talks about, those whose capacity for differences has been eviscerated. Intertwined with these is malignant normality's convincing claim to be unalterable, based on its power to seduce, pressure, exhaust, and stupefy those who might resist even in dreams. So I want to turn now to the way resistance is presented in Minima Moralia. As Stanley Cohen remarks of denial, the question may be not so much why we resort to denial, but why do we ever not do so? Minima Moralia poses the same question about resistance. The question is not so much how entanglement in malignant normality comes about, but how it is ever possible to resist it. And yet, the possibility of resistance is as much the theme of Minima Moralia as is the overwhelming force of malignant normality. Adorno claims that no matter what, resistance is possible, even if barely and precariously. In part, this is the case because malignant normality's claim to constitute the totality of reality is not tenable. It is an illusion propagated by the forces of malignancy. Note, by the way, that a central premise of Lifton's work is that totalization, the claim to absolute totality, is the hallmark of genocidal groups and dynamics. Absolute totality is both destructive and impossible, a contradiction in terms. This is one meaning of Adorno's dictum, the whole is the false. If there can be no absolute totality, resistance as that which is outside or different from the totality is always possible, at least in principle. Accordingly, Minima Moralia is framed as an argument with Nietzsche as well as an argument with Hegel. If, with Nietzsche, we accept that a universal moral law is no longer tenable, still, Adorno says, the amor fati, embracing one's fate, that Nietzsche counsels, represents acceptance of the status quo in the form of resignation. On the contrary, precisely because of the all-encompassing nature of malignant normality, in Minima Moralia, the question of resistance arises everywhere, in the actions of everyday life, in the social relations of the emigre intellectual, in the activities of thought and writing. For Adorno, the individual is the site of this potential resistance. In part, this claim is based on the argument against Hegel. For Hegel, a rational Weltgeist proceeds to the end of history and ultimately completely subsumes the individual in the general. But, Adorno contends, first of all, the trajectory of history has been proven to be destructive rather than rational. The great historical categories, after all that has been perpetrated with them, he says, are no longer above suspicion of fraud. Along the way, the bourgeois individual, once touted as the apex of civilization, the site and beneficiary of autonomous moral principles and freedom, has been revealed to be ideological to the core. At the same time, the forces of sameness produced by global capitalism and the culture industry have made that individual obsolete, replaced in its substance by society. But while the individual's capacity for experience shrinks under the onslaught of the forces of malignant normality, to the degree that it survives in the form of a cast-off waste product, the capacity for experience falls outside the totality and thereby becomes relevant for its critical potential. As a locus of difference, quote, something of the force of protest has passed over again into the intellectual. As historically obsolete, the individual becomes the custodian of truth as the condemned against the victor, the site both of complicity in malignant normality and resistance to it. Despite his studies of the personality traits that make individuals susceptible to authoritarianism, when Adorno speaks of the individual in Minima Moralia, he is not thinking of specific personality types or psychopathologies that would determine which individuals collude and which resist. He is scornful, for instance, of the idea of the mad Nazi, understood in terms of individual psychopathology. Hitler may be pathological in himself, Adorno writes, but what he is in the whole is what matters. Essentially, Adorno is concerned not with who can resist, but rather with what it is in the individual that constitutes resistance. Analogously, again, by the way, in his foreword to The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, which is a group of essays by mental health professionals, Lifton emphasizes that it is not Trump's personality, but rather his contribution to malignant normality that make him dangerous. Adorno is certainly not the only one to consider the question of the possible bases for resistance in the individual. Jonathan Glover, for instance, in his book Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century, asks what kind of moral resources might be available to people in the face of inhumane forces, once it is clear, again, after Nietzsche, that the idea of a universal moral law is untenable. Glover names three: rational self-interest, the human responses of sympathy and respect, and one's moral identity, the sense of the morality necessary for one's self-respect. In another example, in their study of the motivations of individuals identified by Yad Vashem as rescuers of Jews during the Nazi period, Samuel and Pearl Olener identified three motivations: an empathic response to the needs and suffering of the other, a normocentric response based on the norms of a group, or an autonomous principled response. Formulations like Glover's or the Uhliner's lend themselves to thinking about instances of individual resistance, like the following two, which I've taken from Lifton's work. Marie L., a prisoner doctor in Auschwitz, refused absolutely and repeatedly to perform harmful surgeries on fellow prisoners. She, like other prisoners, believed that none of them was likely to survive Auschwitz. Quote, "So the one thing left to us is to behave for the short time that remains to us as human beings," she said. When confronted by the Nazi authorities, she explained that the activities she was being ordered to perform were contrary to her conception of herself as a doctor. In another example, think of the US soldier who, during the massacre at My Lai, simply walked around with his gun pointed at the ground and was heard muttering, "It's wrong, it's wrong." This man, Lifton suggests, had found himself when he joined the army and experienced the massacre as a revolting affront to military ideals. In these instances, we might think of Glover's moral identity or the Uhliner's internalized norms. Like Lifton, the primary focus of whose work is the way individuals adapt to the power of external forces, these thinkers understand that the individual bases for resistance which they identify operate within larger historical and social cultural contexts. But Adorno's interest in resistance is focused neither on the individual personality's motivations or resources, nor on the particular circumstances in which resistance can or cannot take the form of overt actions or refusals to act. For him, the all-pervasiveness of malignant normality, its quasi-total web of entanglements, its penetration of the individual mind and psyche, all mean, as I said earlier, that the possibility of resistance, however precarious and distorted, exists everywhere. Adorno is interested in formulating this resistance as the act of self-reflection on the individual's own experience from what he calls the perspective of redemption, which we heard about earlier. The only philosophy which can be responsibly practiced in the face of despair, he says in the final text of Minima Moralia, is the attempt to contemplate all things as they would present themselves from the standpoint of redemption. Perspectives must be fashioned, he continues, that displace and estrange the world, reveal it to be, with its rifts and crevices, as indigent and distorted as it will appear one day in the messianic light. I want to point out several things here. First, when Adorno uses the words redemption or messianic, or when he uses, as he does elsewhere, the word utopia, he does not mean something concretely specified in pragmatic or conceptual terms. To even ask the question of the goal of an emancipated society is illegitimate, Adorno writes. The utopian hope implicit in resistance does not consist of promises of a paradise of unrestrained production and abundance, or indeed unrestrained realization of human potential. These would merely reproduce the capitalist apparatus of production. Rather, it consists in the hint of freedom from constraint. Second, rather than looking toward a utopia, Adorno is concerned with a perspective from which the present reality can be seen in its malignancy, as indigent and distorted as it will appear one day in the messianic light. Third, taking the standpoint of redemption may furnish a hint of freedom, but at the same time it is virtually impossible to achieve a standpoint removed even by a hair's breadth, he says, from what is. And further, whatever is gained in the struggle will itself be distorted by the status quo. that is, the all-encompassing malignant normality from which it has been wrested. This is the dilemma of resistance. Though it may not manifest itself in overt heroic actions, individual or collective, it nevertheless requires doing something that is almost impossible and that can never be definitive and pure, uncontaminated by its context. To circle back for a moment, the hair's breadth shift of perspective that is the basis for resistance is dependent on the individual's status as a cast-off remnant, different from the malignant quasi-totality. It is this difference that provides the possibility of self-reflection. Self-reflection is not reflection in the abstract, but rather reflection on the individual's own entanglement. Therein lies both the limitation and the redemptive value of self-reflection. While there is no way out of entanglement, at the same time, awareness of entanglement represents the hair's breadth of a perspective on it. Thus, for Adorno, the intellectual in exile, mutilated and isolated, is a detached observer who is, however, as much entangled as the active participant. And the only advantage of the detached observer is insight into his entanglement and the infinitesimal freedom that lies in knowledge as such. Another way of putting this would be to say that the individual's self-reflection on the experience of entanglement is an exercise of thought that unfolds the intrinsic dialectic of what it reflects on. In Hegelian terms, in other words, the individual's self-reflection is an activity of determinate negation. As Adorno puts it, consummate negativity, once squarely faced, delineates the mirror image of its opposite. Okay, last section. I want to focus now on the notion of experience and its role in the possibility of resistance. For Adorno, the obsolete individual represents difference from the status quo, and thus is the locus of potential resistance, because the individual who has not been completely taken over by what Adorno calls the health unto death, the standardization and homogenization produced by malignant normality, is that individual who has not been completely taken over is still capable of experience. Experience for Adorno is complex, specific, individual, and contingent. Knowledge, Adorno says, for instance, comes to us through a network of prejudices, opinions, innervations, self-corrections, presuppositions, and exaggerations. In short, through the dense, firmly founded, but by no means uniformly transparent medium of experience. It is this dense and opaque medium of experience, its eccentric complexity, that makes it both the target of obliteration and at the same time ultimately indigestible by the health unto death. We can think of the eccentric contingency of experience as the complement to the perspective of redemption. It is within the medium of experience that self-reflection takes place, mediating the various aspects of individual capacity from the perspective of redemption so that they become genuine carriers of hope and thus resistance. Without such mediation, each of the factors that might be heralded as the basis of resistance, thought, truth, morality, rationality, knowledge, or the irrational in its various forms, each of them can work against the possibility of resistance, colluding with malignant normality by promoting the denial and self-deception that produce stupefaction. Regarding, for instance, the polarity of thought and feeling, Adorno writes, the assumption that thought profits from the decay of the emotions, or even that it remains unaffected, is itself an expression of the process of stupefaction. Similarly, thought and truth, unmediated by subjective experience, are both vulnerable to colluding with malignant normality. Thought does so insofar as it claims objectivity, claims to see the status quo as truth. It is the cardinal untruth, Adorno writes, having recognized existence to be bad, to present it as truth simply because it has been recognized. That's resignation, bowing down to the powers that be. Genuine truth, or true objectivity, in contrast, depends not purely on thought, but on the hope that flows from and constitutes the perspective of redemption. In other words, resistance can base itself on truth only when truth takes the form of hope. In the end, writes Adorno, hope wrested from reality by negating it is the only form in which truth appears. Without hope, the idea of truth would be scarcely even thinkable. The dialectic of subjectivity and objectivity is central here. Whereas power reverses objectivity and subjectivity, Adorno says, according objectivity to the status quo and dismissing as merely subjective that which engages the specific experience of a matter. In fact, the genuinely objective is available only through genuine subjective experience, in the sense of what I have called the eccentric complexity of experience. Its engagement with the specificity of its object is what constitutes the determinate negation of reality, which in turn represents hope. Hope appears in the experience of the obsolete individual, subjective and objective at the same time, not as something substantial and definitive, but as a kind of aura of freedom from coercion. True thought, the ally of hope, may be inadequate to provide us a systematic and coherent picture of experience, Adorno writes, but this inadequacy resembles that of life, which describes a wavering, deviating line, disappointing by comparison with its premises, and yet which only in this actual course, always less than it should be, is able under given conditions of existence to represent an unregimented one. Okay, finale. Hegel may have been wrong about the cumulative rationality of the whole, but for Adorno, he was not wrong about history having a trajectory. For Adorno, and for us today, and no doubt into the future, the turn of the historical screw continues in the direction of greater suffering. It is not that things are always the same. What is constant is not an invariable quantity of suffering, but its progress toward hell, says Adorno, not only in the development of forces of production, but also in the increasing pressure of domination does quantity change into quality. If, as Adorno says in his introduction to Minima Moralia, those who speak of the individual in the face of unspeakable collective events are complicit, nevertheless, even as the individual becomes ever more complicit and resistance becomes ever less possible, still resistance depends upon hope, which still resides in individual experience and its potential for reflection. Beside the demand thus placed on thought, these are the concluding words of Minima Moralia, the question of the reality or unreality of redemption itself hardly matters. Engagement with this demand is what Adorno's Minima Moralia urges us to today. Thank you.